In the next hour, I'm going to share with you my painless step-by-step formula to create a full concept art piece from scratch. I've done concept art and illustration professionally for the past 5 years, working on big projects like Disney's Lorcana and Shonduras' YouTube channel. I've also worked on art for board games and video games, and I have a lot of experience in marketing art such as thumbnail art, cover art, and capsule art. What I'm going to teach you in this 1-hour tutorial is definitely worth your time. Some of my personal favorite concept pieces that I've ever done have used this exact 8-step process. Additionally, nearly every one of the paintings that I did for Disney's Lorcana also began using this 8-step formula as the base. This tutorial covers the fundamentals to lighting and painting a concept piece. And in this video, I want to just share with you my fast, simple process that I've honed over the past 5 years in order to help you accelerate your own art and learn how to make better pieces in very short amounts of time. If you follow along, by the end of this 1-hour tutorial, you'll have a thorough understanding of how to go from simple meh line art like this into a beautifully finished concept piece like this. So let's just dive in. We're gonna get started with step 1, the initial sketch. So I'm thinking maybe this is a vase. So I feel like the shape could be pushed quite a bit more. What I'm gonna do instead of trying to redraw it is actually just squish it around a little bit with the liquify tool. And then we're gonna add a box next to it. And if you guys want to follow along, try and do this with simple objects like props or even just basic shapes. I think the idea of this is not so much to have a phenomenal drawing, but we just want to be able to understand each of the parts of the painting process in isolation before we go ahead and apply them to something like a complicated character. Now, I like when boxes have these sort of little exterior edges, so they feel a bit more constructed. This is also a way to give them a bit more depth. My hand's a little shaky at the moment, unfortunately, so my line quality is pretty bad, but that's going to be okay. We're going to go through and actually fix up all this shakiness, and I will show you how to do that because I do want to just take you guys through each of the core steps of creating a nice finished piece. Let's just make sure these boards of the box are going at different angles so it doesn't feel too symmetrical, although we do want to avoid tangents, so let's watch out for that. Now we have a nice little stylized crate and vase. We're going to add a couple like patterns maybe onto the vase. I'm also going to just kind of add a little bit of wonkiness to this crate to give it a little bit more personality. I'm thinking keeping those edges a little sharp. Let's add in some ellipses. Make sure your ellipses are following a consistent path through the container. If you have one ellipse that's very squished like this and then an ellipse that's a bit wider, it's going to look off. So just make sure your ellipses are the same angle as each other. So you can see this ellipse right here, it's actually off by a bit. So I'm going to just slightly adjust that. There we go, that looks a little better. We have some guidelines, so now we can start actually doing some shapes in those guidelines. And if I really wanted to make this an awesome concept, what I would be doing is going and finding reference. I'd be looking up real pottery and real, historical things that sort of get what I'm looking for. But as this is just a quick drawing to demonstrate the ways that you can paint a piece quickly, then we're just going to keep it super simple like this. Now, this is what I would consider to be like a rough sketch. You could just go ahead and move forward with coloring it here, depending on how much time you have. There's 2 ways of progressing with this. You could just progress with this in terms of color, right? If we want to move straight to color, we could take this and add in our color into the shapes and then start moving along the process. However, this is a pretty loose, rough sketch, and if you wanted to push it further into a nice territory, there's 2 options. The first is refining what we already have there. So that would mean I'm just drawing over the top of this like this, same layer and everything, and I'm just adding to it, right? And then one of the great parts about the refining process is you can actually start using your eraser to give yourself a bit more decisive choices. So the refinement process is one that I find myself doing a lot more these days. I just find it to be quick and feels a little fresher. So the other version is classic inking. And the reason I'm calling this classic inking is because this is sort of how a comic book artist would approach it, right? You'd have a penciler who would do this rough sketch. I don't know if that's how you spell penciler. There might be 2 L's in there. Who knows? Now, one of my favorite brushes is actually this one called Georg's Elder P4. And I'm actually not sure where I found it, but let's just look it up really fast. You can get a lot of texture quality from this. It's called the Elder P4. One of the things for me that really stands out as having good inking is having good line variation. So you can see how having this thicker outline right here and then having the thinner interior line, I really like how that contrasts. And this isn't pushed as far as we could when we're inking it. So I'm gonna show you right now because we're gonna ink it and I'm gonna show you how to do that. And I'll just kind of really quick talk through what I'm thinking about as I'm inking. So the underside of the surface, I want to be a bit darker because that's sort of where I imagine some of the shadow happening. So by making thicker outlines, I'm sort of maybe implying that there's a contact shadow there or some type of shadow. And then on the top faces, we'll keep these really thin. And then on the interiors of forms, we want thinner lines as well. You don't want to go too thick on the interiors or it's going to draw too much attention. As a general rule of thumb, if you keep your interior lines a bit thinner, it's going to make a lot more sense when you're looking at it. So you can see some of these lines aren't perfect. And so what you can do is just kind of go through with your eraser and just carve out the shape a little bit more. These ones are looking a bit too thick, and I want those interior lines to look really thin. So we're just going to erase them out a bit. Some lines like this where there's an overlap, sometimes you want the overlapping line to be a bit thicker just to kind of show the order. In other lines like this one, I might not even connect entirely to the edge because it will also help with that overlapped quality. And let's do some of these other parts. You can see there's sort of some imperfections in the way I'm drawing, but that's okay because when you're inking, it's okay to actually have some of that quality. I think it can really help and sort of give you an artist's signature. Of course, you do want strong, confident lines as well, but I think there's a balance where if you can actually find a sweet spot where you can have both confident lines when you need them, but you can also have some signatures of the human imperfection. I think with AI being more and more prevalent, any ways to bring in your own human touch is definitely a good idea. You'll notice I'm sort of keeping these planks alternating in terms of the angles. The other thing is you don't need to feel entirely beholden to your underdrawing. If the drawing had mistakes in it or you feel like there's things that you could improve, the inking is essentially another pass for you to go through and actually make adjustments. And I would highly recommend thinking about it this way because if you're just thinking about outlining what you already have, you're going to take it backwards. So it's actually really important to push the piece forward while inking rather than just like copy what you've already done. It might not seem like that big of a difference, but just sort of going in with the attitude of I'm going to plus this thing, I'm going to make it better versus I'm just going to ink it just because that's what you do and I want to have nicer lines. So I'm thinking about little tidbits of the design and shapes that I want here because I want this to sort of feel battered and sort of not super perfect. We're going to add in some sort of marks and nicks. Oops, we don't want to keep it too even. Make sure the spaces between your details aren't too uniform. So that's starting to look pretty cool. And then if we wanted to, we could add in a little bit of details. Maybe there's little bolts right here and here. Let's make sure the underside of these bolts are a bit thicker so we can kind of follow the rules we set for ourselves where these bottom shapes are a bit thicker than the top ones. And then also because of that, we'll go through and just kind of carve out some of the top shapes to keep that a bit thinner. Now we're following the rules that we set and it looks pretty good. Right, now let's do this little vase. Make sure that's a bit thicker. And then have this part come up. See if I can get the proper line thickness. And it looks like that did an okay job. And then we'll make this top of the line pretty thin. As it loops back under, we'll make it thick again. And you can see I'm not necessarily too worried about getting it absolutely perfect, because we can always go back in with the eraser and just sort of trim things down a bit as needed, clean it up a little bit. And let's just make sure this overlap is working. So we're gonna have that be a nice thick line, and then over the top we'll keep this relatively thin. Although we do want to make sure that it's feeling thick enough that it's not contrasting against this back overlap here. Typically speaking, if one object is in front of the other, you can make the front object outline a bit thicker. Let's just do this interior here. Maybe we'll add in another line just to kind of show that that is going inwards and down like this. And then we'll just go ahead and add in this line softly. And here I'm gonna just try and actually make the ellipses. I'll draw a little further than I need, and then we can always just erase that part out. But that ensures that we're getting a proper ellipse. Oops, hand was really shaky there. You can see you don't need perfectly good hands. In fact, I really struggle with sort of shaky hands myself, and it's definitely worse sometimes than others. But it's not really a hindrance to creating good art. Creating good art is more about how you think and how you solve problems. There's different ways to get a nice finished quality from something than just having perfect lines. You'll notice I sort of am curving these triangles as they go around the vase. It's probably not perfect, but it's close enough. Now we have a really nicely inked line drawing. So we're going to go ahead and move forward with that. So I just wanted to demonstrate there's a couple ways of doing this, and you don't need to take it to this level, but it certainly can help, and it can definitely give a piece a bit more polish. And especially in large environments, if you're doing this like lots and lots of props or something, then really managing your outlines like this is super important to creating a sense of clarity and cohesion. Now we're going to move on to step number 3, which is flatting the colors. This part is super simple. I'll just show you how to do that. We can actually delete the underline. Let's see, and this one is our inked one, so we're gonna name that ink. We're gonna name this one pencil. Maybe we'll make the pencil layer blue. A lot of animators would use blue pencils, and so that's why we're going to do it that way. All right, so we've got our ink. Now we're going to duplicate our ink layer, and we're actually going to add a layer underneath this. And we're going to call our group flat / base color. So this is where we add in our flat color, our base color, our diffuse, whatever you want to call it. There's a lot of different names, and it's all for the same thing. So what I like to do when I start to flat a piece, just lower the opacity quite a bit, and you're just going to go through. And you can use a lasso tool, you can use a normal brush, whatever you want to do, but you're just going to go through and basically fill in the shape. So it's kind of like kindergarten, you just color in the lines. This is not my personal favorite part of the process. It can be a little bit boring for me. Thankfully, these objects are very simple, which is why I'm choosing them. And at this point, the color is a bit arbitrary, and we'll go ahead and make the box a nice little brown color. And I'll show you, just to kind of have the variety, I'll show you how you could do this by painting. Although I wouldn't use a brush with too much texture to it, because it can be sort of hard to, it can be hard to get the fill to be super clean if you use a brush with too much texture. And I'll show you what I mean, because I think even this brush we might run into a bit of the problem. I personally prefer the lasso tool because I do feel like it's a little bit faster. But in pieces where you're not going to keep your outline or the line art layer over the top of it, then you probably want to go through and actually draw this line so that it's really nicely designed with nice edge quality. Because as you can see, these sort of jaggedy edges kind of look ugly. But since I'm planning on leaving this line art here, it doesn't really matter because the line art's going to cover the edge anyways. And really all we're worried about is just getting a nice clean fill. So let's connect that shape, and voila, we now have our two things. And this is the flatting process. Now you can see sort of the issue with using a brush with sort of too much texture is you get this ugly little artifacting along the edge. And then you have to go through and kind of like clean that up, which I just find to be a bit tedious because then you're going through the entire shape, you know, 3 times rather than the 1 time that you would have to go through it with the lasso tool. There's also ways to do this in Photoshop that are quite quick as well, just using the lasso tool or the quick selection wand, the magic wand tool, anything really to just quickly get the shape. And you can get the shape in Photoshop much easier from the line art itself. I will show you really fast that you actually can do it. You technically can do it in here as well in Procreate. So if I lower this down enough, you can see, so I'm on automatic mode and I'm selecting the exterior of the shape, and we're gonna drag it just enough that it doesn't fill. So let's go somewhere around 36. So now we've selected the exterior of the ink line. So if we wanted to quickly fill in the interior, we could do it this way. But one issue that you might run into with this, and it might not even be super noticeable here, so maybe this is a perfectly acceptable way to do it, but one thing that you might run into is along these inked edges. Sometimes you'll get some of the color sort of coming through the opposite side of that outline. It doesn't all stay within the bounds. Looks like this one actually did a pretty good job. So anyways, just stuff to be aware of. That's a terrible option if you do need to remove the line art, because as you can see, that's a very ugly looking line. But yeah, just figured I'd give you that as a heads up because it is a viable option if you're going quick, especially when you're using thick, dark outlines. The lighter your sketch layer, the less likely that that's going to work out for you. All right, let's go ahead and raise the opacity back here. Now we've got our flat and base color layer in. You might think I'd be done at this stage with the flat and base color, but what I actually want to do is go in and add some variation to these. And one way you can do this is by adding clipping masks to them, and this is why I kept them on separate layers, is so that we can handle the clipping masks separately. But let's say I don't want my box to just be this uniform brown all the way across. Maybe certain parts of the box are a bit grayer and certain parts are a bit, you know, yellower maybe or redder. So let's just go through and kind of change up a couple of these planks. Right, so we're just gonna slightly shift the color, maybe add in a few more with this color. This would just be to give a slight bit of variation to your crate, and we'll just add that in a place or two. I don't really have a rhyme or reason for why I'm adding these in the way I am, but basically here I'm just gonna go through and add a bit of color variation. Maybe we'll get a little bit of color variation on the edges as well, where this thing has kind of been bumped around. Maybe the wood got lighter as it chipped. So maybe in a couple of these spots we'll see a bit of a lighter edge. And then maybe also we'll actually add in a bit of that on the edges themselves. We actually add in those lines. So this is sort of where the edge wear and tear is happening on the box as it gets bumped around. Just enough to kind of give it a bit of personality. And this is all on the base color, right? So if this were the diffuse color on a model, then this is all without lighting. This is just what the box would look like. If there were no lighting, if it were completely uniform lighting, this is what it would look like. All right, and then we'll go ahead and add a nice little grayish blue for the 2 screws. So now we have a good amount of color variation in this crate. I think it's looking pretty cool. Now let's go ahead and add a bit of color variation to the vase. And what I'm thinking is maybe we have this be a bit of an aqua color. I think that might accent the blue nicely. And then we need to try and get this ellipse right here. It's very important to follow these ellipses correctly. Ellipses are really important because they sort of tell you the perspective that a round object is at, and so if you miss the ellipse, you're actually messing up the perspective, which is what's going to cause it to feel janky. So make sure your ellipses are sort of following the good rules of perspective. Even when you're adding little details to your painting, you want to make sure that you're following the rules of perspective as much as possible. I will say, if you're doing a bit of a wonkier style, the sort of Hearthstones or Fortnites or other things that sort of have this stylized sense of wonkiness, then it's actually okay to sort of break on perspective a little bit, because you don't necessarily need it to be perfect, because the objects themselves don't follow perfectly parallel lines, and so their sense of perspective is already a bit warped. Like, technically the objects are in perfect perspective, but because they're wonky, then it's more difficult to even notice that. All right, so now we have some color variation added in. I'm actually going to experiment a little bit with this vase color because I feel like it could be maybe a bit more interesting. I kind of like having it a bit greener. And then maybe what we can do is brighten this up a bit. So let's take off this ink layer just so you guys can see what it looks like. This is sort of where we're at. And you can see you can actually start making out the shape of, you can actually start understanding what the shapes are at this stage if you do this correctly. We're gonna go ahead and add in some last final details. And the way I'm gonna do that is by adding some gradients to the diffuse. And the reason I'm adding gradients is because I'm imagining this vase and box, maybe they're placed on a bit of a dustier surface. So maybe there's a bit of dust coming up on the side and kind of catching. Maybe that same color of dust is actually hitting here as well. We're getting a bit of that. And then let's just go in and make sure that dust makes sense, right? If the dust is kind of getting kicked up from the ground, it would make sense that it's not covering everywhere. It's just going to get kicked up in the directions that are facing the ground. So let's get rid of the little parts of it that wouldn't get hit by the ground. Rather than just being a soft gradient, now we kind of get this sense of like, oh, that dust means something. Then we're going to go in and erase out some of the gradient with these bigger shapes. And this is to sort of give us a bit of texture. I like doing this. You can do this with a variety of different shapes. Circles tend to make things feel a bit like gross when you use them to cut out shapes. It sort of feels like spider webby, which I think can look nice sometimes if that's what the effect that you're going for. You could also experiment with, just like rectangles or other things. In this case, I'm gonna stick with the circles because I want to maintain a consistent style there. We're just going to go through and add a couple of those over here as well. Add in some bigs. We'll add in some little tiny ones. Just sort of change it up a little bit. I'm going to sort of stipple this area because I'm imagining this area to be sort of a bit more of like a grainy surface to this jug. Like it's got some tooth to it almost. It feels more like sandpaper and less like a smooth surface. That's why we're going to get a bit more of this extra sort of detailing like that. All right, so now we have a nice little dust layer on there, and that helps this start to feel like it's in an actual space. And now we're done with our diffuse flat base color layer. So we're going to go ahead and duplicate this, and the next layer that we're going to do is going to be the multiply layer. And in order to do this layer, I'm actually going to flatten all of this down. Gonna move it down, and we're gonna shift this to a white color because I want to handle this separately without thinking about color. So really fast, let's think about light direction. This is important when you're deciding how to paint a piece. You want to kind of you want to think about the light direction and light temperature. Two really, really important factors to getting your painting to feel right. So sunlight is standardly yellow, right? Unless you're on like an alien planet with a red sun or with a blue sun, then your sunlight's just gonna be yellow or orangish tinted, and it's gonna be really bright. A lot of indoor lighting might be blue-ish or whitish, and that can sort of give a nice feel to have like cool lights and warm shadows. I think what we're gonna do is we're gonna do a warm light, and it's gonna be facing this direction. So I want it kind of coming down, and then there'll be a shadow cast on this edge here. Across this whole thing, there'll be a shadow cast here on this edge. And that's sort of what we're gonna go with. And then you'll get little bits of shadows here and on the underside of here and so forth. So now that we've kind of come up with the direction of our light, now we need to think of if the light is going to be yellow, then our shadows are going to be the opposite color of the light source. And the reason for that is not actually because a light will cause a shadow in the opposite color. Rather, it's because if something is this yellow color, then our eyes perceive something that is gray, like this, to be blue by comparison. And it's just all about the relationship, right? Feels almost purplish blue, versus if we put this gray against a blue, an actual blue, let's go to actual blue. Now, the contrast of that feels almost warm. So you can just see how slightly shifting the colors next to each other can give a sense of temperature. So in order to just slightly exaggerate what's already gonna happen by seeing more of a blue color or a purple color, we're just gonna go ahead and pick a bluish purple color for our shadow color. And then this is where we're gonna use a multiply layer. Multiply layer is great because it will multiply its color over the top of a base color. So you'll get the source color, which is the color that you're drawing with, and then you'll get the base color, which is the color underneath it. And what you can see is that as you move this over the other color, it actually multiplies with it, creating a darker color underneath. See that? So this can be excellent for doing shadows because, as you can see with this white background, the multiply layer shades it lighter, and this blue color, it's shading it darker. And so by using a multiply layer, instead of having to hand pick every shadow color individually, you just choose a single shadow, and then you run a calculation on every color it affects by using the multiply layer, and then it automatically picks the color for you. So at this point, all we have to think about is where is the light being cast and where the shadows are forming because of it. We're gonna imagine sort of where a line would be drawn, and we're gonna draw our shadows. And you're gonna wanna start with big shapes first, which is why I'm going to do this entire outline right here. And I will show you what I'm doing right here also. I'm gonna do this underneath the ink layer, but on top of the box layer, because I'm gonna clip it to the box. So if you guys remember, we actually have this white box underneath right here. If I shift it down slightly, you can see it's gray. We're gonna keep it white, but now our lines won't go outside of that box because we have it clipped. So our clipping mask plus the multiply layer is going to work very well for our shadows. We're just gonna do sort of the same thing we were doing when we flatted, which is I'm just gonna outline the whole shape, and then I'm just gonna drop in the blue. And then we'll just slightly clean up some of those edges. Now we have one of our big shadows shapes blocked in. Now let's block in where the shadows might be cast on this guy. And I'm just sort of trying to look at where the light would be hitting the surface and where it would sort of start falling off as it rounds away from the light. I think right here, it's actually facing far enough backwards that we'd probably get a little shadow under this lip right there. And then importantly, we're actually going to duplicate this box, and I'll show you a quick trick. If you alpha lock the box and then fill it with the shadow color that we have, we're gonna shift this to a multiply layer. Now we're just gonna use distort, and we're still on this shadow box layer. We're gonna use distort, and we're just gonna shift it over I'm gonna turn off my snapping so we can have free control over this. And we're just gonna sort of line up that bottom edge there. And then now we have the shadows cast from where that light would be. I think we're missing it a little bit. So let's try and line it up with that light. So now you can see this light is coming down here, it's coming down here. And as you can see, it's gonna cast the shadow because this is where the light is stopping. And same here, the light is kind of stopping right there. So now we have our shadow shapes blocked in. Now we can actually get into some of the smaller details with the shadows. So let's do that. I'll go ahead and add in some shadows along here as well. And then maybe also on the inside as it gets a little lower, maybe we'll get some shadows. And then the light is facing upward or facing downward. So we're gonna get a tiny bit of shadow on the underside of these, like so. And then because this sort of lip extends outwards, we're gonna get a little shadow here as well. With this one, I'm actually gonna use the opportunity to describe a bit more of the form of what's happening beneath here. So maybe these wood planks aren't entirely even with each other. So maybe some of them go inwards more, maybe some of them are outwards more. So we're actually just going to vary the distance slightly between shadows to give them the effect of sort of being at different depths from one another. And we're going to fill in this entire side right here, as well as a tight sliver across there where the light would maybe be occluded based on the angle. And then we're gonna do the same thing here, just hint that there's a little shadow being cast. It's gonna be really small because the angle of the light doesn't actually tell us that there's much room there for a shadow. Now we're just gonna do this edge as well. And we'll do the same thing on this edge where we maybe describe a bit of what's happening as the shadow is cast, like that. Looks like we might have gone a bit too far out here. Another thing that you can do is maybe one of these planks comes up a bit. So maybe, I don't think you'd see the shadow on that side, so let's not do that. Maybe a better place to do that would be right here, where this plank appears to be coming out a little further. We can add a little shadow along that edge right there, and maybe here as well. So you can see how we can get a lot of detail about the forms and stuff just from these shadows. And then I was neglecting was this little area over here. So I think that's about it for a multiply shadow layer. This layer can be extremely helpful because it's non-destructive, and so you can always go back and edit it without editing other parts of the layers. Let's add these two layers together. So we sort of saw what we had before. Now we're going to add the multiply layer onto our flat base color. Now this new layer is going to be the multiply shadow layer mixed with the flat base color layer. Right, now we're just gonna move it up until it lines up. I think it's about right there. And now, as you can see, our layers added together create this really nice sense of a lit object. First off, we get to see how the colors affect one another. So we can see this blue multiply layer is really strong, maybe a bit stronger than I intended. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna desaturate it and brighten it a little bit. Now I'm gonna take that color and I'm going to fill this other shadow layer with that same thing. Now you can see we have a bit more subtlety in the way that shadow is working. So the next part of this process I'm gonna teach you is about adding in the ambient occlusion. And if you want a piece to quickly feel 3D without much work at all, ambient occlusion is going to be one of your best friends. So let's just talk about how to do that really fast. It's a very simple process. It's a little difficult to master, but I'm going to show you kind of how I approach it and why it doesn't actually need to be that hard. Okay, so as you can see, I've selected a very dark brown, almost black. That's because when things occlude, for whatever reason, they move slightly in a warm direction and then they get super, super dark. So I'm going to paint in the areas where I'm imagining some of this occlusion happening, sort of the areas where less light gets bounced around. And I'm imagining between this face and box, there might be an area that has sort of a bit less showing. So the airbrushes are going to be your best friend with handling ambient occlusion. in painting in ambient occlusion. As you can see, I'm just sort of airbrushing around that shape. Now we've got a nice little sense of occlusion happening between there. And it's very clearly telling us this object is now in front of the other object. So that can be super helpful. Now let's do some other areas that you'll cover with ambient occlusion, and I'll teach you how to do this really fast. When I'm doing ambient occlusion, I'll make a new layer and then draw a new area for the ambient occlusion. So maybe this ambient occlusion we just want right along that bottom edge of this box. And then now that we have that, I'll go ahead and maybe soften it a little bit by lowering the opacity, and then we're gonna merge those two together. Now we have two ambient occlusion shapes added together, and we can rinse and repeat until we have the entire piece done. So let's do that. And I'm gonna go fast. This doesn't need to be perfect. This step is sort of optional, because you don't need ambient occlusion for a piece to clearly communicate, but ambient occlusion will help sell the 3D quality of the piece, and it will make sure that people understand the way that the forms are oriented. So there, instead of erasing out the ambient occlusion, I just used a big airbrush and I just softly brushed in the ambient occlusion. But you can see a big part of my process is sort of lassoing out the areas that I want to be in the ambient occlusion, so I'm not accidentally grabbing parts that I don't want. So can add a little bit up against that edge, and I'm gonna go a little bit over here because I am planning on erasing here. We'll just go all the way through, and now let's use an eraser, an airbrush eraser, and just sort of soften that out until it's almost unnoticeable. Maybe we'll even lower the opacity a bit. One thing I like to do is sort of jump the opacity between full and not, and that way you can kind of see the effects. And then what I like to do is go until the effect is like barely noticeable, because generally with painting, especially with ambient occlusion, subtlety is key. It's really easy to take it overboard, so just be careful. Don't overdo your ambient occlusion. This is sort of a part of the process that can go awry if you aren't careful with it. And we have some nice little hints of occlusion happening. Now let's do this shadow side. And the shadow sides are one area that you're gonna get maximum benefit from ambient occlusion, because they don't have the light defining where the forms are turning. And so they need a bit of extra attention to be able to clearly define what's happening. And so ambient occlusion can be an excellent way to do that. Because this side's in the shadow, I'm gonna actually let that ambient occlusion be a tiny bit darker there. We're also gonna actually do it in the other direction too, because in this scenario, the light is occluding on both sides. Actually, in all scenarios, it's gonna occlude on both sides, but sometimes if there's light in the mix, then it will kind of get covered up. So just sort of erase until that feels about right. Now let's go ahead and add some to this top layer. Actually, in order to do this quickly, what I'll actually do is block all of this out, and we're gonna do two big black lines. And then I'm just gonna go ahead and erase those. But we have just a sliver. So you can see this process, it's really not rocket science. It's quite easy to do. It does take a bit of practice to sort of have the subtlety that you need for it, but overall it's a very simple process. It's not physically hard to do, but if you just toggle that ambient occlusion layer on and off, you can see how much depth we start to get when we add that in. So that's one of the best parts about ambient occlusion, is just how much three-dimensionality you can get from it without much effort. So let's add some into the interior of this vase. And let's just erase most of that out. I just want a hint here to show that, okay, as it's going inside, it starts to get a bit darker. And again, subtlety is key, so let's back off on that a little bit, and we're good. And then let's add in a tad along this back edge, where I imagine maybe we're getting a tiny bit of occlusion over there. And maybe even a tiny bit on the underside here. So let's add those in. We're just gonna take that airbrush and go really subtle with it. really, really subtle. Just go ahead and use the smudge brush to kind of push this into the places we want it to be. There's nothing really too complex about this. It's really just a matter of thinking about where the light would stop shining. So when light hits an object, it bounces off of it, right? And then it bounces onto other objects around it. So what happens is there'll be bounce lights that kind of affect the objects around them. What happens when there's no bounce lights, because the light doesn't have a direction to bounce, then it starts to get really dark, and that's what this ambient occlusion is. So we're finding those areas where there's not a lot of bounce light, and we're trying to push a little bit of extra darkness into them. So now you can see with the ambient occlusion added and with the multiply layer added, we've got a really nicely lit crate and base here. And at this point, in terms of describing these objects, we've actually pretty much covered all of the bases, right? This carries most of what we would need to then model this out and then texture it and throw it in a game, right? So this is about as much information as we need. But just in order to give you guys sort of the maximum tools that you can have, I want to explain how to take this a bit further. So what I just showed you guys, the whole process, this would cover standard objects. They're called Lambert objects is another word for them. Lambert objects are objects that sort of reflect things normally. So no sort of shininess to them, just a dull rubber ball or a dull piece of cloth or anything that doesn't have shine on it, essentially. In 3D software, oftentimes this would be called roughness. If your roughness was set to the max, then that would mean your object is Lambert. With Lambert objects, there's not much to do after this point. However, there are certain things that can affect the shadow quality. So even though this sort of doesn't make any sense, maybe let's imagine that this box has subsurface scattering happening in it. Hey guys, me from the future. I wanted to kind of clarify what's going on with the subsurface scattering and why I've chosen to do subsurface scattering for the box and the vase. So typically speaking, I probably wouldn't use subsurface scattering for these objects. One of the intentions here was simply to demonstrate a commonly used part of the process. So I tried to do it in a way that felt naturalistic and wouldn't take away from the box and the vase. But I wanted to point out a couple times where you would use subsurface scattering more regularly, like in the case of skin and flesh. Other times, hair actually has quite a bit of subsurface scattering that will kind of show up. Leaves especially have a lot of subsurface scattering present in them. And you can kind of see like an object without subsurface scattering will kind of feel very hard-edged and harsh. And an object with subsurface scattering will have a nice sense of like glow and transition from the light to the shadow. So I just wanted to point that out so that nobody was confused and nobody's wondering like, oh, do I need to paint subsurface scattering in every single object? And the answer is no. You can just paint subsurface scattering sort of as you wish, mostly just in places where you think it would help sell the material quality, or if you just want to add a bit of pop and add a bit more saturation to a piece that otherwise might feel a little bit dull. So subsurface scattering is when a light will go through an object and then it sort of bounces around a lot within the object, and then as a result, there's a subtle glow effect that will happen in the shadows. So I'll show you how we could add subsurface scattering to this box. And because it's a box and it's not a human with skin or something, we're gonna keep it super, super subtle, because I don't want it to feel weird. But subsurface scattering can often add a really nice sense of vibrancy to things. So sometimes even if things don't have a natural subsurface scattering, I like to add it in because it just makes them feel a little juicy. So what I'm doing here is I'm on my multiply shadow layer. Right now I had it selected, but what I can actually do is alpha lock it. Then if I draw over the shadow layer, it will give me this effect. So what I have is I have this blue shadow layer, which if I turn it to normal, it's this color. And now what I'm doing is I'm finding a color of what I imagine the interior of the wood. If the light bounced around inside of it, what color would it shift towards? And I'm imagining it would bounce around and it would be really orange, and so we'd get a little bit of an orange highlight there. So I have this multiply layer that's this color. We're gonna use this clipping mask to draw over it like this, but it's really important that I use a darker color for the shadow itself than I use for the subsurface scattering, because the subsurface scattering needs to feel like a glow, so it can't feel darker than the multiply layer. So now let's switch this back to a multiply layer so you can see what that does. You can see we get this sort of nice warm looking shadow rather than the sort of gray shadow. So if we do that just at the edges, and we kind of get this effect that the light is like sort of glowing through that shadow side, we just get this nice little vibrant hit along the edge, right? Where we have a tiny bit of that extra color coming through. And on skin, this would be red, right? Instead of orange, because blood vessels would cause it to be more of a red color. So for skin, you'd want it to be a bit more reddish. But because this is a box, I'm imagining it's not filled with blood vessels. It's filled more with just nice brown wood chips. So we're gonna just go through and sort of add a little bit of that on all the parts that we want to, anywhere where it might look kind of cool to have. Maybe right on these edges, we get a little bit of that. That looks kind of cool. And so this is just a really nice way to give your shadows a little bit of extra juice. Even though this is a box, now we have this nice sense of vibrancy happening on that shadow side of the box. So let's go ahead and show you now what that could look like for this part of the vase shadow, because maybe this vase is actually made out of something slightly see-through. Maybe it's a nice thin porcelain, and so you'd actually get a little bit of extra color out of it. Now we're just gonna add a nice little green to that edge. You can see how much sort of vibrancy that gives us too. So it's a very subtle change from the one before, and this effect isn't going to make as much of a difference on normal objects, but on skin you definitely want to take advantage of it and make it a little bit more dramatic, because human skin has quite the glow to it when it's hit by light. And so what I can actually do to make this a bit more visible, we're going to go ahead and shift this all to white, so you can kind of see what the actual multiply layer looks like. So now we have this tiny little bit of subsurface scattering happening. And what I like to do for this part, this is sort of, at this stage I'll use an add layer. In this case we have a couple of metal gray screws or nail heads that aren't currently getting affected at all by the light. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the light color, which is this yellow, as we had decided earlier, and we're actually going to add some nice little tiny highlights to the tops of those screws. And add is great for this because, as you can see, if I do a soft add, it's going to be almost more of an orange as it transitions. And then in the brightest part, it's going to be that yellow. Right? So if we were to take this brighter, you can see this effect will be even more dramatic. We'll get a white instead. But the problem with using light colors on add is you don't get as much of the vibrancy. So you actually want to stick with the darker tones like this, and you're just going to get a little bit more out of it. So now you can see those look like metal screws. We've got some metal screws going on. Another thing you can do with add is actually add a couple of form highlights as well. So you don't need to just stick with tiny little highlights on the metal parts, because maybe other parts of the object also might have a highlight based on the direction they're facing or based on the material quality. In this case, we have that light directly facing some of these divots. So what I thought is maybe we could just add in a couple of highlights in the divots and on the edges where the light would be directly facing. And then with these ones, we're not going to go as crazy as we did with the metal. We want to keep it much more subtle. I'm just going to lightly brush it in. This might even be too much, right? That feels a bit too too bright. So now what we can do is just select those highlights we just made. We're just gonna lower the saturation a bit until they don't feel too vibrant. So that feels about right to me. Now we've got some nice little highlights along the edge there. Maybe we can actually highlight that entire upper face a little bit with an add layer. Now what we're gonna do is take a really big airbrush, and I'm actually gonna make a new layer because I wanna be able to erase out some of this if needed. We're just gonna take a big airbrush and start loosely filling some of that in. So now you can see we've got this nice little highlight along that upper edge. Now we're just gonna merge those two together, similar to how we did with the occlusion layers to keep it simple. Now we have this nice little highlight layer for our box. So let's go ahead and do the same thing with the vase. In the case of the vase, we have a yellow light. When green gets hit by yellow, it's gonna shift slightly towards yellow. So instead of being an orangish color, we're actually gonna get a slightly greener tone of highlight. Let's just brush in a hint of what the upper highlight might look like for this object. We're gonna use the big airbrush to sort of erase out some of that as well. So we really just want this, I'm just imagining which part of the vase would be directly hit by that light. We erase it out here on this back edge. Since the light is coming from the front, it will only reflect on the inner face. And then we'll cut out all the directions that aren't facing the light. And we'll just keep that super subtle. In fact, we might have gone a little too much with this part. But now we have this nice little highlight up here too. One thing you could do at this stage is add some bounce light. So this is a very green box, so maybe some of that green will shift it slightly towards brown as well, because when you mix the box color with the green of the vase, you're going to get something in the middle, more in this yellow zone. So now we could just go ahead and add in a nice little bounce from some of that, and we'll just make sure that that's only covering areas that would be getting direct bounce light. Maybe we'll even carve in a tiny bit of an edge here, just to show that that's a light source and it's not the color of the wood. And what else we could do is we could even add the tiniest hint of little edges. Now you can see how that little glow actually does quite a bit to sort of sell those two objects sitting next to each other. It is much too bright at the moment because bounce light is way more subtle than you think. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to darken it a ton and saturate it so you can still see the effect a little bit. But yeah, keep that bounce light super subtle. It's a very powerful thing. You don't need a lot of it. So that's about how I would approach the process of painting some standard objects. As a bonus round, I'll just show you kind of how I would tackle sort of certain glow effects and metallic effects as well. And I'm going to use an add layer again. Add layer can be great for adding sort of the final highlights just because it gives a lot of vibrancy, but it also raises the values, so it'll help sort of pop some of the areas you need it to. So in our case, I want to keep this yellow color of the base light source because this is going to be a direct reflection. So we're actually going to get a pretty close color to the light source. I'm sort of imagining the light source maybe is split into two separate parts, with one being slightly brighter and wider than the other. Now I'm just going to boost this one up a little bit. I think it should be a tad wider since it's a broader part of the surface. Now we're just going to go ahead and adjust those ever so slightly so they're not so bright. Now we've got sort of nice little highlights there. You might even get a tiny touch of highlights along this edge here and here. So keep that in mind. You can kind of embellish little areas if you feel like there's a reason that the light might catch on the edge. All right, now we're going to use color dodge, and I'll show you what we can do with that. So our light source is a bright yellow. We've got these little glints here on these nails. I'm gonna actually add in a bit more so we get a full-on white spot right on the edge of those nails. Now on our color dodge layer, I'm going to choose a very yellow color. I'm going to make the airbrush a little bit bigger, and right on those highlights, we're just going to add a little pop. You can see how that sort of gives it a glow effect and sort of makes it feel extra juicy. So this glow effect is so powerful, and you need to be so careful not to overdo it, right? Because if you like super heavy-handed with this, it's gonna look crappy. It's not gonna help the piece, it's gonna hurt it. So doing something like this makes no sense. However, if you keep it really subtle like this, can bring a lot of vibrancy out. You can see how, because I'm doing this over the line art, it's actually affecting the line art too, which I really like personally. That's about as far as I would take this for these particular objects. If you made it this far in the process, I can tell you're really committed to your art. And so I'm offering free feedback sessions, completely free 1-hour feedback and coaching sessions to the first 5 of you who submit a design that followed the entire formula from start to finish. If that sounds like something you'd be interested in, just submit your designs and email me at jarednickerlart@gmail.com. Like I mentioned, it's completely free and it'll really help accelerate your own art journey. Hopefully you found the video helpful. If you did, I would love for you to leave a comment about what you'd like to see me cover in future videos, and also consider liking and subscribing if you found my content useful for you. I'd love to gain some traction so I can keep teaching you guys all the industry secrets I know. Anyways, thanks again, and bye.